Welcome to Rasmus Haukedal. He's from East China Normal University. Rasmus Sandnes Haukedal is a postdoctoral researcher at East China Normal University. He earned his PhD from Durham University in 2023. In his thesis, he employed an organizational perspective to argue that current expansion of evolutionary biology represent a dialectical turn. Building on this foundation, his postdoctoral project explores philosophy of mind, developing an organizational understanding of cognition. During his PhD, he was a research fellow in Marie Skłodowska-Curie program, Real Smart Cities, and he co-convened the reading group at the Center for Culture and Ecology. He is currently an editorial member of Dialectical Systems and Salongen. I welcome and request Rasmus Haukedal to present his talk on the topic the dialecticals of life towards a unification of biology and philosophy. Yes, please,
Okay.
Dr.
Hello.
Rasmus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for that generous introduction. Let me see. I want to share my screen. So let's see. Okay. So I just realized now that some of the questions that were just raised for Professor Levin might be answered in my talk, at least partially. And the question of whether there's a fundamental difference between inert and living systems will, indeed be addressed. So I will just jump in. So my talk, as you can see, is called The Dialectics of Life Towards the Unification of Biology and Philosophy. And you give me 45 minutes, right?
Correct. Yes, 45 minutes
okay.
presentation and then 15 for Q&A.
I will try to stay within the boundaries of 45 minutes. I'm afraid I will go a little bit over, but I will try as best as possible. Okay. So, in the modern age, as you all know, nature has become something is considered dead and external. And this is something that's been called the death of nature. This was a term used by Carolyn Merchant in her book by the same title. And it's the kind of notion that nature is just a background for our action thing. It's been reified and it's something passive. And while this notion, this mechanistic notion, has been successful in some ways, as it has driven forward a lot of scientific progress, I would say that I think we are at a point where this notion of nature and the kind of science that it implies and leads to is impeded by. So we need another philosophy of nature, basically. So this is my outline. You can see I begin with a very, very short background story, which is a little bit about the modern synthesis. Then I move to the organizational perspective, which is a kind of contrast to the modern synthesis and part of the kind of the ongoing extension of this framework. Then I go to probably the main part, which is then about Hegel and the dialectics of nature. And then finally, I get to the question of what does this mean for science? And so I will just move on quickly here. So first, the modern synthesis. In short, it is just the merging of Darwin's theory of natural selection with Mendel's theory of inheritance. While Darwin's theory could explain how traits would spread in a population, Mendel's theory would explain how these changes are stably inherited from generation to generation. So it's kind of this idea of a missing pieces that Darwin lacked a proper theory of inheritance, and he got that from Mendel. I'm not saying this is correct, but this is the current like normal interpretation. So you see then that evolution then is defined as the change in allele frequencies in a population. This is kind of the basic definition. In her seminal study, Betty Smokovitis called this a delicate balance. The reason she called it a delicate balance is because this synthesis was inspired by the positivistic ideal of unifying science. But if it went too far in that direction, then since this ideal was reductionistic, then it would mean kind of it would make biology as a science redundant, because then biology could just be reduced to chemistry or physics. So it needed to balance these two things, and it did that by saying that the laws of biology are emergent on the laws of physics and chemistry, and therefore irreducible. So this whole research program is quite shaky, actually. And this was my experience when I studied it. I began by, I have a quite clear conception of what it is. Then the more I read, the more I tried to understand it, the more I realized that this is rather diffuse body of work, quite difficult to pin down. And this is because the people that made this whole framework were disagreeing upon about a lot of things. And there was also the difference between the UK version and the US version. So one might argue, and this is something that Joseph Bruce has argued recently, that it's more accurate to call the modern synthesis a kind of philosophy of nature than to call it a research framework or a paradigm. And the reason for this is precisely because it doesn't have this kind of cohesion that you would expect from a research program. So from this, then, I think we have to ask the question, if it is a philosophy of nature and we find it's an inadequate philosophy of nature, what should then replace this? And this is what I will propose in my talk, what we could replace this philosophy of nature with. So we can see here the three main points of agreement. It's the primacy of natural selection, the gradual rate of change, and the continuum between macroevolution and macro and micro. And basically, macroevolution is just microevolution happening over a longer time frame. This is kind of the simple, yeah. So this is what Moss calls the phylogenetic turn. We don't really have time to look at this now. I just mentioned it. And then here we have a list of, this is of course not the exhaustive list. This is just a list of some of the different things that is considered to challenge the modern synthesis. So it's epigenetics, need construction. Yeah, you can see all of these things. I will later speak more about niche construction because I think it's useful for multiple reasons, but it also has a very clear like dialectical not only is it similar to dialectics, but it's also like historically tied up with the dialectical way of thinking. So you could say that for those who want to extend the modern synthesis, the main question is whether it can provide a complete understanding of evolutionary change. And to those who are traditionalists, they would say it's been continuously expanded and it's already taken on all the challenges, and it can still be, it doesn't need to have like a more like radical revolutionary expansion where we overthrow this way of thinking. And I think there is something to that. But this is also part of the reason why the modern synthesis is so difficult to pin down, is because it has been changed so many times. And for those who think that you should revise it, and I mean, also within those camps, there are differences in what they mean by that. But they would say that insofar as the modern synthesis is able to take into account the processes or the different factors that they are talking about, it offers at best the deflationary reading where the significance of these processes is still not really acknowledged. So they are not acknowledged as drivers of evolutionary change, at least not to the extent that the revisionists wanted to be. So there is a lot of variety here, and I'm sorry for not being able to really to do it in such a quick manner, but I think this is something that people are quite familiar with, but I hope you can ask questions about this later if there's something that's unclear, of course, and I will try to elaborate. So then we get to the second part. So I should first say that we could say that the main thing that maybe characterizes the attempts at extending the modern synthesis, the thing that kind of is similar to all of these proposals, is that the organism needs to be put front and center of evolution once again, the way it was arguably in Darwin's theory, and this is also something you find in the organizational perspective. So this is a theoretical kind of systems biology, and they are searching for organizational principles for biology, which are not directly tied to empirical research, but still has analogies and is it's not apart from empirical research, but it is about principles that they think you need to understand living systems, that these are kind of universal principles. So it's a modern form of organicism, and it's about the interdependence of parts and their relation to the whole. And I will just start by explaining constraints, because this is quite important to this perspective, thinking in terms of constraints. So constraints, to put it easily, are just boundary conditions that selectively harness matter to perform functions. This is kind of this is the definition that Patty gave in 1972. And they will often take the form of spatially distributed physical factors acting as organizing principles. Some of these conditions, such as gravity and electromagnetic fields, are relatively independent of what they constrain, while other concern components that are generated and imposed by the organism itself, such as a cell membrane. And these, of course, then will be more plastic. So this is the difference between holonomic and non-holonomic constraints. And as you can see, the constraints, they would challenge the flux of energy and matter, but they would remain locally unaffected by the processes they constrain. This is what differs constraints from processes. And here you can think of a riverbank and a river, where the riverbank would be the constraint and the river would be the process that it constrains. And although constraints also change over time, just like processes, they don't change at the same time interval. So in this view, and this is quite important, is that there's no unconstrained level. So the activity that goes on at every level is constrained in some way, and you can't explain it in isolation. And there's also what's called bioresonance between levels. So in this view, we can only explain how physical and chemical processes operate by explaining how they function within the living system. And this highlights the autonomy of biology. So you see it's the same kind of, achieves the same goal as the modern synthesis by different means. And finally, you should also say that since constraints enable processes to perform functions that they could not perform without these constraints, constraints are also enabling. So they are not only restrictive, but they are also generative. So the organizational perspective then says that there's a very big difference between, there's a fundamental difference between inert and living systems. And they argue that the principles that apply to physical systems are inadequate for understanding living systems. It does not simply explain biological function through past natural selection, but through its role in maintaining a living organization. So it's also a different way of explaining biological functions. You know, in the modern synthesis, you would always say that the function, anything that exists is in principle functional because it has been selected by natural selection. But this is a kind of circular way of arguing. So anyway, it has a different way of explaining function, and this is, as I would say later, also similar to Hegel's view. Biological organization is about a certain kind of interaction between the parts of the system where all the parts contribute to maintain the whole. This is what is called organizational closure. And as we see, there are three theoretical principles. The first one is the default state of cells, and it's variation and organizations. I will go through them in turn. The default state, I will just say something briefly about this. So this is, it says that cells, their default state is constitutive proliferation with variation and motility. To say that it's a default state, of course, means that what you have to explain is not this occurrence of motility and proliferation, but you would have to explain how this doesn't occur. So, and motility then is the capacity to initiate movement, and this gives the cell a kind of agency. So, it's probably similar to what was spoken about in the former list. Yeah, but the point is rather simple. Against the default state of physical systems, which is inertia or rest, the default system of biological system is movement and variation. So it's about change, not invariance. So we move on to variation. Variation is another principle. In the modern synthesis, variation was considered something random. It happens through mutations which occur without any kind of. It doesn't have it doesn't occur because it's biologically beneficial. So in that sense, it is random. It's not channelized by evolution itself, and it's only given kind of selective value by natural selection. So, but this made it difficult then to explain something like eyes, and this is the same example that Professor Levin, of course, used, like how are eyes produced in a coordinated manner? And of course, the answer then would be constraints, constraints on variation and the activity of cells. So then we go to, like, there's another term here that's a little bit technical, but it's about something called extended criticality. So I guess criticality, you could just say, is about levels of where there's a change from one qualitative state to another, a critical point. And this notion of extended criticality underscores the difference between biology and physics, because physical objects rarely change their symmetries, their invariant properties. And when they do, it happens at specific critical points, whereas for biological systems, change happens constantly. And within, instead of at pre-given points, it changes within interval. So this means that randomness is something different in biology than in physics, because it does not mean that all possible changes have equal probability. Because in that case, what can happen is nonetheless known in advance. In biology, it's not only that we cannot know what will happen, it is also the case that we cannot know what can happen, since we cannot pre-state the possibilities that exist before they are actualized. So this is something that, for instance, Stuart Kauffman is known for, this kind of way of thinking. And the point is that living systems are changed in unpredictable ways throughout their history, and that there is an emergence of new properties that cannot be predefined. So in this sense, they're like poised at the edge of chaos, basically, is what Stuart Kaufman would say. They occupy a place within order and chaos. They make use of chaos to produce order, in a way. And they can remain what they are only through constant change. So they are fundamentally historical, and this is also tied to contextuality, because in a different context, you would not be able to pre-define what might happen. So then finally, we come to organization, which I guess is arguably the most important of these three principles. So organization requires differentiation of parts. And all the parts need to contribute to the overall organization, but they contribute in different ways. So they are not interchangeable. And this goes back to the first lecture we had earlier. Differentiation separates organisms from purely dissipative systems like flames, because in a flame, all the parts would just serve one function. When constraints reach closure, there is interdependence between them. And this is called the closure of constraints. So you can see here that the existence of each constraint depends on the existence of others, as well as on the action that they exert on the dynamics. In this kind of situation, the set of constraints realizes self-determination as organizational closure. But very importantly, organizational closure is coupled with thermodynamical openness, exchange of material and energy with the outside. Because otherwise, there would be no way to perpetuate the organization. So in this way, you could say that closure does not mean independence or being completely locked off from the world. Instead, it should mean like it underscores that the organism is inherently coupled to the environment. And closure is therefore just a tendency. Had actual closure been achieved, then that would mean death for the organism. So this is a way of self-determining through self-constraint or self-maintenance. And from this follows teleology and a kind of natural normativity, because there is the organism basically has no choice but to act teleologically, to maintain itself and to maintain its relationship to its environment. And therefore, Stuart Kaufman calls it a Kantian whole, after Immanuel Kant. It's a cause and effect of itself. So here, the end goal of the activity of the system is to perpetuate itself through its environment, you could say. So these principles are all related. Organization and variation are interdependent, and the default state is the primary generator of variation. So while physical systems are generic, interchangeable, and decided by their context, every living system is unique or specific. For this reason, their possibilities cannot be deduced in advance. Instead, their space of possibilities is subject to constant change. So this means that you are beyond the kind of like dynamical systems theory. Although dynamical systems theory is still relevant, it requires that you predefine all the different things that may occur, and then you calculate the probabilities. But here you go one step further, and you cannot calculate the probabilities because they are not given in advance. So insofar as we may speak of causes, then we should speak of differential causes that are changes to the enablement relationships between the organism and its niche. So this is why Giuseppe Longo speaks about historicity at the heart of biology. So this is pretty much sums up what I have said, that there is no way of, there is no law that entails the evolution of the biosphere. And yeah, about unpredictability. So this is Giuseppe Longo, while Montévil, and Stuart Kaufman, of course. So then we get finally to Hegel. And I will now try to show how Hegel might be useful to the organizational view, and how the organizational view might also cast light upon some of Hegel's notions. So I think it's fair to say that no modern thinker has been subject to so many divergent interpretations as Hegel. And I think what I will say is probably not the normal, well, it is a more and more prevailing notion, but it's not the school book version of Hegel, to put it like that. It's not the caricature that we often are met with. So there's been a new, very strong interest in Hegel, and especially now in recent years, been a renaissance. And in this renaissance, there's also been a renewed interest in his philosophy of nature. And I think this rereading of his philosophy of nature is a way of overcoming persistent misunderstandings of his overall project. So there has been two opposing interpretations of Hegel's philosophy of nature. It's either been seen as purely a priori, and in that case, it would be that Hegel is simply trying to find, in an external way, he's trying to illustrate his philosophical concepts and kind of try to offer some scientific confirmation or buttress his concept through science. The other reading is empirical. It says that Hegel is basically acting as a scientist. And from this view, they dismiss his philosophy of nature on the grounds that science has changed so much since this time. So it's like outdated. That's the kind of argument. So therefore, we don't need to deal with it. But Kenneth Westphal, who's a very important Hegelian and has written a lot about this, he says that both of these readings miss the holistic character of Hegel's philosophy, because Hegel does not say that science and philosophy is the same, but he says that they are continuous. And he tries to make his discourse about, like, when he speaks about science, it's neither a purely scientific discourse, nor is it a purely philosophical discourse, but it is something that emerges from their interplay. I will try to explain what that something is. But contrary to the caricature then, Hegel believes that science provides the content upon which philosophy must work. And he says, and I quote, that the empirical sciences have readied this material for philosophy. So against the image of a philosopher that's completely uninterested in science, is the typical how do you say, just looking at science from the outside, from his chair. He is deeply engaged with science, and he even worked alongside scientists when he wrote his philosophy of nature. And I also think that it's clearly his work prefigures modern research in some ways. And this is not a surprise, actually, because historically dialectics was very important for scientists. So Gambarotto and Illetterati, they speak about three ways in which, this is from an article about Hegel's philosophy of biology, from a special edition of Hegel Bulletin. So they say that there are three areas where there's convergence. There's the nature of biological organization, the role of teleology, and the relation between life and cognition. I would add that I think he also, you can see, and of course this is not completely set apart from the 3 points that they make, but I also would say that he highlights the reciprocal interdependence between organism and environment, and that also his notion of randomness dovetails, or contingency, you might say, dovetails with the notion that you find in the organizational view. But I will not be able to really substantiate all those claims, but yeah, I will try to show some of it. So first is, what is dialectics? I thought it's useful just to mention the three laws of dialectics that Friedrich Engels speaks about. And of course, it's the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation. And I think you could say easily that, well, first of all, you should say that these laws are informal, and they should be interpreted more as tendencies, because since his view is historical, there are no permanent laws in one sense, so it is misleading to read them as scientific laws or laws of nature like that. The first one is, of course, similar to phase change, like from water to ice. The second is similar to the relation between organism and environment. And the third one is, of course, the principle of change, of how new properties are produced through the interchange of opposites. So they are all related. But I think you can liken the third one, negation of negation, to the historical change of the space of possibility, where the negation of negation would be the negation of the whole space of possibilities, in a way. Based on like negation of things that are internal. So I would say all of these three laws are about, especially the first and third, concern emergence. So emergence, of course, is a word that is often thrown around, and like it is about irreducibility, how something, there are emergent levels that have their own laws that you can't reduce to, or own principles that you can't reduce to the behavior of the levels beneath it or above it. So this is, but it also implies downward causation, but I don't really have time, unfortunately, to go through emergence. Just mention the dialectical biologists. So this, again, I underscore the kind of historical entwinement between dialectics and science, and you could say that ecology, in a way, was formulated through dialectics, and then you have Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, Richard Lewins, that all practiced a kind of dialectical biology. And dialectical biology, according to Richard Lewontin, is about, it emphasizes the way in which the organisms define and alter the environment in the process of their life activities. So this is very similar to niche construction, which also, of course, was originally proposed in many ways by Richard Lewontin. And it's about, how an organism is able to affect its own evolution by changing its surroundings. So this, in this way of viewing biology, then the organism is not the mere object, but also a subject. So we go to Hegel. This is about Hegel's view of the organism. He says that it's essentially process. It's a process of self-differentiation and of unity at the same time. So Hegel speaks about three stages, and this is like the geological organisms. You can think about the planet as a whole, but it's not saying that the planet as a whole is alive. He's saying that it's the precondition of life. Then he speaks about plants, and he says that plants lack the differentiation of parts. So the parts don't have a specific identity. This is similar to what was presented earlier, so I would just go quickly through it. But in a living organism, then, parts become members. And it means that they serve a specific role which is circumscribed by the whole organization they contribute to. And I would say that this is very similar to the organizational notion of differentiation and functional ascription by contribution to the whole. And the organism clearly depends on its material and energetic exchange with the environment. It mediates itself through its other. And this is what you could call a process of attunement. So Hegel then points to something very similar to the principle that you find in Richard Levantin is that we cannot speak really about an environment without reference to the organism that occupies it. So it means that, like, although you could speak about material surroundings, the organism makes use of a subset of the whole material surroundings and makes it into a niche, and only those things that it affects it and that it affects is relevant to it. So, it means that those things in the world that correspond to the nature of the animal itself counts as relevant and guides its action. And then in this way, it makes its surroundings into a world. It constructs a niche for itself through habit formation. So it means that living organisms, they not only do they sublate mechanical and chemical process, they also negate, in a way, their physical environment, turning it into something that it is intertwined with, integrated into its own functioning. So, yeah, so this is from the Science of Logic. You see Hegel says something about how the organism is affected by the outside world, and it's not as a mechanical object, but it's excited by the outside world. It's not determined, and it's excited because it's already in a relationship with the outside world. It's established some historical connections that it can respond to. So what it responds to then is something similar to what you speak about in ecological psychology. It would be something like affordances. So it's not the world per se, but it's the world that is presented in a specific way based on the capacities of the organism and its historical interaction with the environment. So quickly then about subjectivity. So you have the first sense is a concrete unity of different parts. So this is we already been through it. The second sense is this autonomy and how it is able to interrupt mechanical causes in a process of attunement. So I think you can see that autonomy then and dependence is very closely related. And the organism is then able to self-determine by making use of its environment in a specific way to further its own existence. So internal purposiveness is directly tied to self-preservation. Again, very similar to the organizational view. So then you have the third sense, and this is what is called self-feeling. And of course, this is at the level of life. We're not speaking about the mind here. We're not speaking about consciousness. Hegel says that the organism is characterized by lacking. It experiences this lack. And this feeling of lack leads to an activity of deficiency that opens the organism to the outside world. It spurs it forward. And it shapes the organism through this interaction. So this is something I think is very similar also to here you get up with the notion of how the mind is constructed through the persistent precariousness, or what Hans Jonas called needful freedom. So again, you see this kind of how the mind emerges through a practical interaction with the outside world. So let's see. Oh, we're getting very low on time. I tried to be quick. And it also, I think it touches on the notion that a living system is characterized by constant change. So it acts on itself and the outside world in order to continue being in transformation. So I think we are okay. Yeah, you see, I'm already gone through this.
Dr. Haukedal, you've put such a immense presentation together. If you're interested, we'd be very interested in hearing your presentation of this without any kind of time constraint. If you'd like to meet on Zoom, whenever you're available tomorrow or the next day, and then we can record your full presentation without any time constraint, and then we can link
Yeah, sure.
because we really
Yeah,
want.
no, I'm happy to do that, but I can try to wrap up this part if I'm able to.
Yeah, please.
So here we get to why I would say we should move from Kant to Hegel. And of course, Kant, he said that teleology is a heuristic. So he said that, okay, we need to understand, this is okay, of course, also very similar to kind of modern biology as well, like teleology is kind of a mistress, for the biologist, they can't live without her, but they don't want to be seen with her in public because it's very difficult to explain what organisms do without some kind of reference to goal, like directed behavior, although they try to eradicate this, of course. So Kant would say that it's useful for research, but it lacks ontological reality. Hegel says that this is a great service that Kant did to philosophy, but there's a tension because he doesn't have a way of uniting ontology and epistemology. So there's a tension there. Hegel, to solve this tension, Hegel would say that as living beings, we're already engaged with the world, and this is the only way we can gain knowledge about it. We can know the world because we are part of it and because there is structural similarity between our concepts and the world. He therefore speaks about the reality of teleology, of purposiveness, and also the reality of the concept. And this is basically talk about the reality of the concept is the way to acknowledge that there are some intrinsic self-organizing features in nature. So there's some kind of inchoate rationality in nature itself that makes it intelligible for us. Moreover, the concept is embodied by the activities of the organism and is differentiated in their judgments. But this is not only a movement outwards where we impose concepts on the world. Instead, the concepts themselves emerge from this interaction, from the inchoate structure that is already in the world. So there's some kind of externalism in the way that Hegel thinks about concepts then. And this is why he also says the idea is when the ideal and the real meets, which means that the ideal would be the concepts as we have them in, apply them, have them as logical determinations, whereas the real would be the concepts, how they exist in nature. So the move from Kantian to dialectical wholes then is the move from a regulative to an ontological interpretation of teleology. And also this is a naturalistic understanding of teleology for Hegel because it doesn't require consciousness. So it's not a psychological understanding of teleology, purposiveness. So we get now to this is the final slide in the part about Hegel. Well, it's not really, but it's almost. So this is where we get to the notion of nature. And he says that it's nature is the idea in its otherness, but it's the idea shown in a fuzzy way. And this is very important for Hegel because it shows why his theory is not about deducing natural determinations from logical concepts. Instead, he's basically saying the opposite, is saying that our concepts will never fully map onto the world in a one-to-one manner. Logical categories, as we describe them, must be presented in a fragmented manner in nature, because nature is contingent, and each singular thing would never fully display our ideas about it, So although reality is permeated by thought, it only displays the rationality in a fragile manner, and it can never immediately coincide with our conceptual structure. So this means that Hegel kind of wants to eat this cake and have it too, because he says that we can know nature, but we can't know it fully. But this is not because our capacities lack something, but it's because of nature itself as an ongoing historical contingent process. So nature is not unknowable, but it's inexhaustible. So Hegel's naturalism then, and Hegel's philosophy of nature is a very like, it says that ideas and conceptual determinations emerge from within externality, and as such it breaks down the strict kind of difference between nature. Like it doesn't have this kind of what Terence Deacon called incomplete nature, where a lot of things that emerge from nature are said to be unnatural. So it's, how do you say, like it's a way of breaking down the boundary between culture and nature, and therefore it offers what has been called a non-naturalistic kind of naturalism. And I think it opens up, like I would say that this new view that you see, for instance, where you say that historicity is at the heart of biology. When you have this, if you apply this to more sciences and you try to include historicity in the way you understand them, then it really opens up a space for a different kind of interaction between sciences. And also one thing I should mention is that Hegel also says that the contingency of nature imposes strict limits on philosophy and on science. And we should not like have this notion that we can fully grasp nature, because that would be like a kind of lead into a kind of subjective idealism. Instead, we have to take into account the kind of ongoingness and how nature is something that is alive and historical. So, as you can see, Sean Gallagher then asks whether science itself, whether it can remain the same within a different kind of naturalism. And I think that this is the question we need to face today. What kind of science do we want? And how can we get a kind of critical science where we apply the principles that that result from scientific research to science itself? And this is what they say, like, you need to try to integrate experience. You need to try to integrate life, I suppose, as the condition for experience. And you have to, like I say, apply the results. So this is, I'm just mentioning this just in passing now, that you can use niche construction as a way to understand scientific practice. And in this view, you also consider, instead of speaking about theory, you speak about theorizing as a practical activity that happens as part of other practical activities. So the difference between theory and practice kind of breaks down. And in this view, you see how you can use a theory like niche construction as a research resource to explain other topics. So, and this is, you can see here the kind of the way they are thinking. Just leave this quote here for a bit. And so this is the final question. I would say that it's a question of what's called philosophy in science, and whether we are kind of at the watershed of some kind of scientific revolution. I don't know, but I think at least what we should do is that we should not necessarily think about whether we need like a strict framework, but we should instead think more about how we practice science and what kind of philosophy of nature is required for scientific progress. And also, I would say that this notion of philosophy of science in science is something we can learn from Hegel and the way he dealt with science. So I think I should stop there. So we